So, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Pleasure.
Please introduce yourself. Tell me a bit more about you.
Yeah, so I'm Jamie Broadley. I'm the Group Head of Health and Wellbeing at Serco. Serco, one of those big businesses that most people probably haven't heard of. So we're
Oh, everyone's heard of it, but what do you actually do? That's another one.
yeah, most people probably heard of it for the wrong reasons. So,
Okay.
don't believe the tabloid headline writers for for a start. So yeah, I mean, Serco is literally a service company, so it's government outsourcing. We employ around 70,000 across the world, so 4 main regions, and we're so diverse. So I think from a wellbeing perspective, think of a wellbeing challenge and we will have it somewhere within our business because we operate across we run prisons, we're in immigration, which is obviously a really challenging space at the minute, through to we've got engineers working at the European Space Agency, we've got people out in kind of defence contracts, making sure our ships are out on the seas and all the rest of it. So it's from a wellbeing point of view, it's fascinating because there's every kind of challenge you could think of, and with the kind of the geography and all of those regions as well, there's all of those then kind of cultural mixes too, which just add to it. So I've not got bored yet in my role, put it that way.
I can imagine. So you're the head of health and wellbeing. Where do you report into, and have you got a team?
Yeah, so we've the way that we're structured is we've got 4 global kind of regions which effectively operate as their own businesses, and they're split into business units and contracts. And then I sit in group, which is the kind of the bit that sits over the top. So that's where board and all of that, the kind of senior leadership there sits. So I'm in the health, safety and wellbeing team, so reporting to the director of health and safety. As you can imagine, a business like ours, health and safety really crucial. And then he reports into our chief people officer, who reports into the CEO of the whole business. So I don't have a team, but we have people out in all of those regions and business units who have often nature and wellbeing kind of triple hatting, who may be doing things side of desk as well, and then kind of think of all the different regions that we're in. They're all called different things as well. So we have to be quite flexible in how we approach it. But
that's interesting.
Yeah.
So you've almost got a community of these advocates who are out there. Is that a formal part of their role, or?
So we have got an ally network.
Okay.
So that's strongest probably in the UK. We have smaller ones in Middle East and North America as well, looking to establish one in Australia, and that's a kind of side of desk champion style role. But we try and give them as much support, training, all the rest of it as possible, and we don't pitch those as the kind of mental health first aid style model. We much more see them as a kind of almost like a marketing tool. So they're the ones that are out there in their contracts, the friendly face who will say, oh, if you're struggling with this, then we've got that available, and that level of intervention. And then it's up to us to go through the kind of the more formal routes. So where we've got kind of the safety teams, the HR teams, and work through those channels to try and do some of the more kind of work design side of change.
Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah, that is really interesting. We've talked to a couple of guests about this idea of, well, it comes up all the time. How do you create change across such a large organisation? And these networks, obviously I'm biased as we run a community ourselves, but I do believe that these communities are the way to do that.
Definitely.
Part of the picture.
Definitely. So there's it's kind of one of the ways in which we do that. And I guess this is a theme that may come out in this conversation, is the kind of the stuff that I think works in wellbeing isn't the sexy, shiny stuff. It's the slightly dry, boring stuff. So you make change through kind of good governance processes, good assurance processes, having the right committee structures in place, all of that kind of stuff to make sure that, I mean, the kind of the cheesy phrase from NHS world, which is where I came from, is kind of board to ward. So how do you connect between those two? So you've got to have those structures in place so that if something happens on one of our contracts, there's a feed through to make sure that that gets captured, that gets reported, and then change can happen further up the tree to prevent that from happening again, or to put those things right. Absolutely. So it's like sharing across business. So we've got our kind of like health, safety, wellbeing oversight group, for example, where people from across our global business get together, many of them unfortunately having to have an early morning or a later night as a result of the time differences, and talk about challenges. So our justice and immigration business is a great example where the challenges in prisons are kind of fairly universal with local nuance. So bringing together those contract directors from Australia, from the UK, sharing and finding solutions, that's how we make change. It's not necessarily through kind of webinars and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I got you. And I was doing a bit of background research on you, stalking you on LinkedIn. I was reading, are you working towards or have achieved ISO 45003?
Yeah, so become kind of tagged with the ISO 45003 guy, which is definitely
Sorry.
not all good.
At least you know about it. Do you know,
Yeah.
a couple of years ago when it launched, I thought, oh, this will make, because I'm a real geek around that sort of stuff. And psychosocial risk. I
Yeah.
thought this will make a really big splash, and I'm still waiting for the
Waiting for the
splash.
splash.
Yeah.
I thought exactly the same. So I landed at Serco about 3 years ago. And my predecessor, that was one of the things that he kindly set up as a little arrival present for me, as saying, I think we should go after this. I'd obviously worked with safety teams in the past, but I had no experience of working with international standards or anything like that. So it's a very steep learning curve. But we went through that process. It took us about a year. But I know Hayley Farrell will probably argue with me on this one, but because she got it first for MCOR, but we say that we're the kind of the first multinational that got it. So that was quite a process. We've been through a re-audit from that, and so that sits at our kind of group level and looks at our management system as a whole. So whilst we've kind of not applied it at every contract, it means that the management system they're working to is certified by it. And now we're going through the process of kind of getting out into those contracts and putting them through audits. So just 2 months ago, we went to HMP Ashfield, which is a Cat C sex offender prison. So the psychosocial risks for our people there, hearing the kind of stuff that they hear every day, absolutely kind of significant. So we felt that was a really important place to test this out in practice, and kind of proud to say that we got them through it.
Great.
So that was, again, no one's challenged us on this yet, so I'm going to keep saying it until someone does, but we think that's the first prison in the world that's been certified to it. So it's given our dominant safety culture, it felt an easier kind of framework to lean on, to enable kind of people to get their heads around change and to structure some of the work. So we've kind of gone all in on 45,003, which does mean I have to speak about it more often and have to be very honest about where my understanding runs out, and where I have to lean on kind of our experts internally.
Yeah. All right. I'll take the hint. Stop asking.
All
Stop
good.
asking.
No, it's good warm up for the questions I will undoubtedly on the panel later on.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. Just a bit of a tangent, but you mentioned the prison that you're working in and the psychosocial risk, only because I've worked in a few similar sorts of settings previously. Never assuming what their psychosocial risks are is important as well, right? You assume the psychosocial risks will be, the people that they're looking after. Rehabilitating every single day. But actually, it's the relationship with their manager. It's the amount of admin emails they've got in to go on. It's the lack of full resources. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And especially in some of these environments like prisons where it's fairly rigid in that you have a regime, and making changes to that regime can be hard, and then there's all the buzzer goes off and everything changes for the day because there's been an incident. The thing that really impressed me at Ashfield, which enabled them to get through that certification, is the fact that kind of the people side of it is just baked in. So from the kind of the daily briefings through to the way that the psychology team work, not just with the prisoners, but looking at what is facing the prisoners and then feeding that back to the staff to make sure the staff are prepared, just trying to get ahead of those risks,
right,
gives them that kind of that bit of headspace, so that then some of the other stuff, which might be the kind of the daily annoyances, which build up and build up and build up, you've got more space to get those sorted because you're not constantly in kind of firefighting mode on the other stuff.
So I'm not sure I'm going with this question, but do you think there's an opportunity within environments like that take safety very seriously, that there's an opportunity for well-being in there, in the sense that, so you mentioned at the start that you report into the health and safety, right? And I think that's really interesting. I think that's an area that's going to start growing over time. And this idea that health and safety, particularly in certain organizations, whether it's construction or, like where you have to take health and well-being you have to take safety seriously or someone could die. You can take that same sort of mindset and perhaps transfer it to health and well-being, which is often seen as soft and fluffy, but someone could die,
Absolutely. And the reality is people are, sadly.
Absolutely.
And there's been some really high profile cases, especially kind of like the legal professions have really been having to face into this recently. And I think it's such an important point. And it's something that, having been in wellbeing for kind of 10-ish years now, I've started the kind of the yoga and fruit bowl end of it. And increasingly now, much to my own surprise, finding myself having to learn more and more about the kind of the safety side of things. And I think someone told me a great kind of analogy for it the other day, is that if you think about kind of asbestos exposure, that obviously that was something which was an unknown risk. We started learning more about it very rapidly, and then we've had to put things in place so that you don't get exposed.
Yeah.
If we were to apply the way that most of us are trying to deal with well-being risks to it, it would be kind of making people's lungs more resilient, and getting them doing breath work to try and improve the lung resilience, rather than trying to remove the exposure.
Yeah.
And that way of thinking, that framework, just hasn't happened in well-being yet.
Yeah.
And that's, once you've started doing a bit of it and seeing the impact it can have, that's hugely frustrating, because it's the kind of the cheesy phrase is change the work, not the worker.
Yes.
And if we look around kind of outside this booth today, 90% of the stuff that's exhibited here is about trying to change the worker.
Change the worker.
And that's just missing the point, I think.
I agree. Yeah. I love that analogy as well, because also it's really important, you know. So you think about asbestos as a metaphor, as an analogy for well-being. I'm guessing at the time when the studies started coming out saying it was dangerous, there will have been some people who were like, "Oh, come on, it's not that bad,
exactly.
you know, like, man up, you know, I'm still going to work with asbestos. It doesn't make a difference." And it was only over time that it's like that now everyone's, I mean, borderline terrified of it. Like, we've got asbestos in our roof at home. And it was like, it's a big deal. You know, what do we do? And you do feel like, it'll become, perhaps there will be things that we do now that in 10, 20, 30 years time, they'll be like, my gosh, like, why were you doing that?
Well, it's such an important point. I think that, that kind of longer term thinking, these are slower moving risks in some cases. But also they can be very quick moving. It's that kind of asbestos is one example, kind of working at heights is another example, where you take immediate precautions around that and think about it much more short term. So I think that works as a metaphor too. But again, not my phrase. Someone gave it to me the other day, and I will use it on the panel later. So I'll
don't worry, this isn't being published before the panel. You'll be fine. Yeah.
It basically said kind of like, act now as if you're going to be judged in 5 years' time. And I think that's such a helpful frame, because so much of the stuff that we think about is kind of immediacy, firefighting, kind of we're still in that person pops up and is feeling stressed, so let's try and give them something now. All very well meaning, but actually that kind of longer term view means that we might take some of the kind of potentially harder decisions, some of the slower moving actions to try and put preventative stuff in place. And we've talked about prevention in the wellbeing space for a long time now, and we've not really made any headway in it. And I think this is a vehicle for being able to do that. There's a lot of difficult conversations with senior leaders and what have you along that route, but potentially one of the other dynamics is the amount of kind of millennials starting to come through into leadership positions, and that kind of changing culture around well-being that's just starting to happen. That presents an opportunity potentially as well.
Yeah, I think so. Although I heard that 15 years ago at events like this.
Yes.
It's slow. No,
there is a degree.
I agree. No. Sorry, I didn't mean it in that sense. I meant that it's slow. I meant that it's slow. That I agree with you. But, you know, because you've got a passion about this area, it's like, when are these millennials going to arrive? Like, take over now. And then it'll be the next and the next. But yeah. Right. So I've gone deep into ISO and safety, because I love that stuff as well. But you mentioned you've worked 10 years in wellbeing. Tell me about, where did you start? So take it right back from the beginning. Where did you go to school? No, don't answer the thing. You know, what was your route towards?
Yeah, so my route was psychology, and obviously immediately feeling kind of imposter sat with an actual psychologist. So I kind of did a degree in psychology and was told leaving school kind of like, do your A level, go and do your degree, do a master's, then you'll get an assistant psychologist role, then you'll get onto the doctorate, and kind of no more worries about what you'd have to do in your career. You sorted. So went to uni, did psychology up at Leeds, did a master's in health psychology after that. Nice. And that was the time when the kind of the '07 recession happened, so immediately aging myself here. And all the kind of paid assistant psych roles disappeared. So started as a voluntary assistant psych in learning disabilities and doing kind of care work on the side out in the community. And at the same time, like, part of my background is sport, so was my rugby career was starting to take off a little bit at that point as well. And eventually landed in a position where I was kind of playing rugby full time, but had negotiated an extra day off and was doing a kind of 20-hour a week assistant psych role in health promotion service, which was tier 3 weight management. So diabetes, diabetes, there's a phrase, we can go with that. Diabetes, obesity, and people who were either preparing for bariatric surgery or kind of looking at lifestyle interventions. So I was kind of in this world where I was trying to eke out every bit of performance for myself to try and push my rugby career, and then working with people at the complete other end of the spectrum. and also bumping into some of the kind of old school dietetics views and things like that. And the kind of the origin story is that had to go and do some essential training NHS wise. You kind of get sent to a village hall somewhere to do something there, and was sat with a load of nurses who were complaining about having not had any lunch, kind of grabbed something from the vending machine, and I was looking at them and thinking, there's not much difference between you and the people that are in our service here. And there was a stat at the time where the kind of rates of obesity were higher in the NHS than outside in general population, which was just madness to me. And NHS being NHS, that went through a restructure that service did. My role dropped out, and I was kind of looking for gigs. So I did my personal training qualification, and that led to a very fortuitous conversation with the HR director who was looking at bringing PTs into their organisation. That was social work. It led to a role being created, which was kind of a HRE project role, dealing with wellbeing. Couple of years there with social workers, went back to the NHS trust that I previously left as their head of wellbeing. There was a community trust, so worked across a number of sites in Derbyshire. We then took on a mental health trust and kind of spread out across that, worked there through COVID, and then the opportunity at Serco came up. So I think kind of all of that, no career design or planning involved it, very fortuitous, but the kind of the golden thread, I suppose, is sort of well-being and performance. So it's not just kind of let's take everyone off and do a forest yoga sound bath retreat. Like we need to get stuff done at the same time. So how do we balance those two things? And a real passion for frontline, because one of my frustrations in the wellbeing space is so much stuff is just targeted at people with laptop luxury, kind of middle class, in those kind of office roles, and that is such a small proportion of where the actual challenge is. So that NHS experience gave me that kind of like public health view of things as well. So that's a real passion.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And the thing that always strikes me is how different people's roots are into this space. And I tend to feel it doesn't matter. You know, I feel like it, as long as you've got that red thread of the kind of the passion for the subject and an interest in it. And we've just recorded a podcast of another person who was saying it's the focus on people, you know, as long as you want to help people. That was his values-led way of developing his career. But in terms of how people come into it, if you could go back and speak to yourself at Leeds Uni, in the moments where you were sober in between nights, if it was anything like mine, I'm not saying you're the same, then what advice would you give that person now in terms of this route towards a wellbeing leadership?
I think I probably was following the advice without realising it at the time, but it's just that kind of like, say yes, get your hands dirty and go and try things and make a bit of a mess. The amount of things which I look back on now and think, oh, if only I'd known. But that's how you learn. And
go on then. What did you mess up?
There's too many to cover on here, I'm sure. But I think the amount of resilience training sessions I did in the NHS, I still stand by that content. It's great content. But the world's changed, and now, to my point earlier, we need to look at the work, not the worker. So you'd need a bit of hindsight for some of those things. But I think ultimately, like to your point, wellbeing's about people, and the real skill in this is about understanding people and being able to kind of go and engage with them and to understand. I think then marrying that for a kind of wellbeing lead type role, whatever the title might be, is then also being able to step outside of that, see big picture, see strategy, and engage boards and leadership with it. And those are skills which, I've done presentations to CEOs which have completely bombed in the past because I was too heavy on the kind of the passion, the people side. And like they're passionate about that as well, but that has to be tempered with what's realistic for an organisation, whether that be public sector or private sector. The levers might be different, but there's still going to be that other view, and if you're too kind of foot down on one side, you're not going to get through to their language.
You've got to speak their language. I was about to say that phrase. We hear this. Absolutely. The other one was you mentioned it just briefly before, knowing what you don't know as well. So you mentioned with the ISO standard that there's plenty that you just don't know, so a willingness to say that.
And the advantage of kind of big businesses, certainly Serco, is that we've got experts everywhere. They're just hidden. So actually, just today, I was asked to do something for one of our bid teams in Europe, which obviously I wasn't able to do for being here. I was able to connect them with one of our forensic sites from one of our prisons who's normally never seen beyond the four walls, and they'll do a far better job than I can. So it's kind of elevating those people and giving those people a platform and sharing that knowledge. But also I think and I've just done some qualifications in this more recently, but that coaching approach is so valuable, of just being able to kind of be curious and not be the expert. And certainly when you're working across big organizations, especially across cultures and geographies, you might never visit that site that you're trying to support. So it's really arrogant to assume that you can just rock up to a conversation with them and tell them what they need to know. It's much more about that kind of, that curious mind and being open to saying, well, you tell me, teach me. And that often gets to far more interesting stuff.
Sounds good. Sounds great. Right then. So just before we finish up, were there any burning things that you wanted to get off your chest that I've not managed to extract from you during this session? Was there?
I don't think so. I know, obviously, kind of fire a few shots in plenty of directions in the wellbeing space, but I think our conversation's probably covered some of my thoughts around where we should be going. And I'm not saying that Serco are kind of perfect in that or a destination by any stretch, but certainly there's I think I missed a spicy talk yesterday on the kind of the wellbeing washing from what I've been told by a few people. So it'd have been nice to come off a long run for that one. But no, I think covered it. Great questions.
Yeah, nice one. Thank you for your time. Where can people find you? Obviously, you're speaking at the Watercooler today, so people can find you there. But
I'm pretty old school and don't do a lot social media wise now. I try and get my head down and just crack on, and then if there's anything of interest, I'll find it through.
So you don't want people to know. You don't want people to find you.
LinkedIn's the one space where people can go if they so wish to find out any more. But I can't say that I put anything particularly interesting on there. So
Oh well, at least they can find you. They could ask you. They could ask you some questions.
Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah. Always open to answering any questions.
Ace, amazing. Thank you so much for your